I'm Rick Tarnas, and I'm going to introduce our esteemed speaker tonight. Every year,
Could you speak?
speak louder.
Please, if you could.
Yeah. Every year, we bring the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program, PCC for short, a graduate program from CIIS in San Francisco, California Institute of Integral Studies. Every year we come here and do a retreat, conference, tribal gathering, reconnection with the mothership, with the sacred ground. And we open up all our sessions of presentations, lectures, sharing. We open them up to the whole Esalen community and staff for the week. But on Wednesday night in Huxley, going way back, certainly after the early 1970s, we always had an open evening. This is always here at Esalen. Wednesday night in Huxley was when all the seminars that were going that week would not meet, so that everyone could come and hear something special that would take place in this room. And during the years that we've been doing this, we would have the PCC program would have our Wednesday night program here, where we would, in a sense, kind of showcase, usually one of our faculty members, sometimes several, discussing work that not only would be close to the heart of what we're about and what that particular teacher, scholar was exploring, but also what would be very possibly of interest to the Esalen community and to those who are here visiting this week. And tonight, Sean Kelly is going to share with us his thoughts and images on the idea of a Gaiapolis. Gaia, of course, the great goddess, the symbol of our unifying planet, and polis. I'll let you take the Greek etymology. Let me say a word about Sean. Canadian scholar.
Quickly becoming American now.
Yeah, especially since Obama became president. And one of those people who has taken two great deep thinkers from two different fields, Hegel, great metaphysician, philosopher of Western history, and Jung, a great depth psychologist, and become a profound expert in not only their thought, but also the underlying unity and coherence between these two profound thinkers, one that reaches deep into the inner psyche and out to the whole cosmos. And in that sense, Sean is that person in our program who is especially competent in encompassing that breadth of philosophy, cosmology, consciousness that our program aspires to understand and articulate to greater and greater insight, experiment, adventure, and new horizons opening up every year for us here. And let me just say that many who are here are also the students and alumni of our program, who certainly all of us faculty members have learned at least as much from them as they have learned from us. So on that note, I'll give you Sean Kelly.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you all for coming. I'd like to begin just with an expression of gratitude. Is Jeff is here. There he is. Jeff is such a master at expressing gratitude. I can't do it as well as him, but I aspire to. Just so much to be grateful for. I won't go through the whole list. It's not the Academy Awards. But along with the great mystery that one can never really thank enough for simply being, especially all of you, and you know who you are, and even those who I don't know personally, I'm grateful to you for being here. I'm just grateful. A question for you. How many of you have heard the word Gaiapolis before? And not from me. Okay. Well, I thought I had invented the word. I was wrong. And when it came to me, it was like a revelation. And of course, I went online, searched Gaiapolis. And it's actually a word that's been, it's an obscure Japanese video game. So I couldn't buy the domain name Gaiapolis.com. It's all bought up. So anyway, I still really like the word. The word, for some reason, just has a ring to it. Now, you all have a sense of Gaia. Polis, a Greek word. Normally, when you hear polis, at least in academic circles, you think of the Greek city-state. It's a Greek word, originally referred to Athens, but then more generally, the idea of the city-state, and then a kind of generalization of the term to mean a city, as in metropolis, for instance, or megalopolis, giant city. We'll see a lot of that tonight in the slides. Tonight's going to be mostly slides, and I'm going to try to give some sort of coherent commentary to the images. But I'm taking this word polis not only in the more restricted sense of a city, and by a city I mean humans living together with some kind of shared intentionality. And for the Greek ideal, of course, it was a self-governing community. Of course, there's only Greek men of a certain class who were that self-governing committee. But it was the beginning of something. It was the beginning of an ideal which has continued to evolve over the last couple of thousand years. But if we think of polis in the sense of a city, of course, cities go way back. I'll show you an image, at least, well, depending on how we define a city, at least 5,000 to 10,000 years. So there's a sense of polis as a city that I want to focus on. But the more general sense of polis is going to be civilization, human civilization. Now, civilization, of course, is related to civitas, the Latin for city. So polis, civilization are linked in that way. So Gaiapolis suggests some kind of fusion of Gaia, the earth community, and polis, human civilization, or human being together. So human being together in a way that's not other than Gaia. So what might that mean? Now, there's at least two senses. One sense is a fact that Gaia and polis are now fused. It's impossible to separate them. There is no part of Gaia that doesn't bear at least the subtle, either radiological or chemical imprint of the human presence on the planet. We cannot go anywhere. You might be able to drill down deep enough and find it, but certainly on the surface of the planet, the oceans, the air, most of the land. Gaia, if we understand Gaia initially as something that, as someone or something that was here before us, can now no longer be differentiated, pulled apart from us. So whoever we are, the human presence, and Gaia are, in fact, now fused, for better or worse. That's a kind of fact. But Gaiapolis is also a dream, is what I would like to suggest. It's a dream of the earth. Now, Thomas Berry is the first one that I know of who used this term, dream of the earth. And the dream of the earth, as I understand Thomas, was of an earth community, a mutually enhancing earth community, where the human presence and the other than human presence lived in a mutually sustaining, fulfilling, and sustainable way. Obviously, we don't have that, but that's the dream, right? So there's Gaiapolis as fact, and there's Gaiapolis as dream. I want to explore that a bit with you with a series of images. And the first image, I'm sure you've seen it before. I don't know why that input. Oh, good, it's gone. Now, can we kill some of the lights?
How about just dimming rather than
Dimming,
killing?
sorry, yeah. Can we gently coax the lights? Diminish their apparent radiance.
Temporarily.
All right.
Decrease the photon.
Yeah, so here's a composite image.
You know how to do it, Adam? You just push there's a buttons underneath that they...
And then I'm going to ask Chad at some point to come and take his second position of service. I don't have a remote, unfortunately. Chad will be my proximate remote. Still not working.
It's not like
All right. The Earth from space at night, and the lights you see, of course, are lights of cities. So polites, human habitations. Just one particularly compelling indication of how the human presence is, at this point in the evolution of Earth, sort of fused with Gaia. So the one question is, how did this happen? How did this come about? So to understand the fact of Gaiapolis, even before we can sort of get into the dream of Gaiapolis, it's helpful to try to get a sense of the evolution of Gaia. Now, all right, so this summer I was at Schumacher College. I co-taught a course with Stephen Harding called Gaia and the Evolution of Consciousness. And I had the great joy to be led with the students and Stephen on a Gaia walk. Now, I had done Gaia walks before, but usually in a room or a certain distance. But in this case, he guided us on a 4.6 kilometer walk along the coast of Devon, the southern coast, walking toward Dartmouth. 4.6 kilometer walk representing the 4.6 thousand million years that Gaia has been around. So, now this is just, we won't spend any time on this. This is one way to try to understand the age of the Earth, okay?
Memorize this in the next 5 minutes.
The various epochs, it's amazing that humans have reconstructed, have helped Gaia retrieve her own memory of her own development. This is a kind of recollection, an anamnesis of Gaia's own self-becoming from the point of view of human geologists. Now we are like way up there. Can't even see it. Next slide. This is a more colorful representation of some of the ages of Gaia, and we don't even show up on this one. We're too recent. Next. Okay, now here is, I captured this image from Google Earth. If you haven't played with Google Earth, I highly recommend it. It's a lot of fun, and it's not only fun, but it's actually a way of participating in this emergent consciousness of Gaia, where Gaia is awakening to herself. I will say her, if you don't mind. That sounds better than it. Where Gaia is awakening to herself. Well, Google Earth is one of the ways that this is happening. So there's Dartmouth next. There's a close-up of the coast leading, where we walk, 4.6 kilometers, leading back to Dartmouth. And I want you to imagine you're going to walk 4.6 kilometers. It's about 9,000 steps. each step you take, 500,000 years. 500,000 years. 500,000 years. 9,000 steps. Just imagine that. So we're walking. Now, when you first start walking, Gaia has just formed and is a ball of molten rock. A ball of molten rock. Brian does this so well. The other night he talked about how you start with carbon atoms and so on. Give it a spin and here we are, right? But it took a long time for that to happen. So walking, doing this Gaia walk, I tried to feel into Gaia, what it must have been like for Gaia to go through this process. It occurred to me fairly soon as I was walking that the first state, what state of consciousness was Gaia in? The first state was like a deep, dreamless sleep, a kind of trance. So while Gaia was apparently nothing more than a ball of molten rock, you're walking, and you're going to take roughly 1,200 steps. You know, it would take us a while, 1,200 steps. Each step 500,000 years, until somehow, miraculously, we don't know how, this ball of molten rock became life. Organized itself into these communities of molecules that are self-organizing with a cellular boundary that we call life. We really don't know how that happened, but it happened. All right, so once this happened, it was as though Gaia started dreaming. Came out of this trance, this deep, dreamless sleep. And this was the first dream of Gaia. You might say that life was the first dream of the earth. That's how it felt to me anyway. So we're walking, and I'm waiting for something to happen. And I'm wondering when, okay, got life. That's amazing. What's going to come next? But here, you know, we are walking for, we have to take another 6,000 steps. Each one 500,000 years before we get to the first multicellular organisms. So it's basically 3,000 million years where life is only single cells. It's impossible to grasp, but you can really feel it when you're walking because it takes time. So there's this dream going on. Finally, right, multicellular organisms. Keep walking, another 1,800 steps, approximately 70 million years ago, we have the first flowers. Another 150 steps, things are accelerating now. By this point, the Earth is populated with dinosaurs, with all kinds of wondrous animals, unbelievable giant plant forms, including flowers. At this point, roughly 65 million years ago, we have an asteroid that seems to have hit the planet and caused what's called the fifth mass extinction. There have been 4 mass extinctions prior to that. That was the last one that occurred about 65 million years ago. Wiped out the dinosaurs and so on. At that point, the only mammals on the Earth were little shrew-like beings from which all subsequent mammals evolved. Keep walking, 120 steps. To 200,000 years ago. 200,000 years ago. This is actually, from now on, we're sort of almost frozen in the last step. So we've walked about 8,999 steps. And we're about to take the last step. And it slows down. And that's when our species emerged, Homo sapiens sapiens, about 200,000 years ago. So everything from now on is going to happen during this last step, which hasn't quite hit the Earth yet, 200,000 years ago. Now here, it sort of felt like perhaps Gaia was awakening. This is what humans have always told ourselves, is that with Homo sapiens sapiens, the wise, actually the super wise mammals, sapiens sapiens, that somehow the animals in the Earth were waking up, were wise. Now, we don't know whether that's true. Something obviously very monumental happened. it seems more like maybe there was the beginning of awakening, a fitful awakening, but where we're still in the grip of a dream, many dreams perhaps. Maybe it's like a hypnagogic or hypnopompic, I guess, in this case, state, humans. Now here we're at let's do the next slide. It's just some more of the scene we're walking. One more. This is to give you a sense of comparison for those of you from San Francisco. 4.6 kilometers is roughly from the Cliff House at the top to the San Francisco Zoo. So you can walk along Ocean Beach. And if you did that, it would be about 9,000 steps. So you could recreate this walk there for yourself. Kat and I are going to try to plan that out and find some of the major markers where the events happen. Okay, next slide. All right. Can everybody hear me?
No.
All right, now I'll try to talk louder. Okay. This is Stefan from last summer. Once we had arrived in Dartmouth, and we're at the very last part of the last step, and he took out his measuring tape for the last yard, basically, the last meter. So the last of 4.6 thousand meters to try to give us a sense of where the human presence is. Now the human presence in terms of human history, everything that we know about from written records and everything apart from stone tools actually, is happening within the last centimeter, the last 100th of that last yard is where everything is happening. It actually is much smaller than that. If we think of the last 100 years, which is when the age of cheap oil, second industrial revolution, and so on, has brought the planet to the point of the sixth mass extinction, which is happening in our time. Right? The last one was 65 million years ago. All of that has happened within really the last 100 years, which is the last 100th of a centimeter of that last meter. Unbelievably fast. So on the one hand, the human presence seems radically insignificant compared to the almost inconceivable or unexperienceable stretch of time that Gaia has been here. On the other hand, it's within that last freeze frame step or slowed down step that Gaia seems to be awakening to herself as a result of our presence on the planet. So how do we understand that? Next slide. To understand it, we need to understand, so we looked at Gaia. Now let's look at Polis for a bit. This is a region of eastern Turkey. Armenia. Well, it's Armenia. Well, I know, Turkey, Armenia. It's disputed, let us say. Where fairly recently an archaeological site has been found. It's called, pardon the pronunciation, I'm sure it's wrong, Göbekli Tepe. Next slide. This is some sort of reconstruction of what it might have looked like, at least in its structure. Next slide. This is a stone that was unearthed from it. Now this site is very important because it's so old, first of all. It dates from fairly soon after the last ice age, so about 10,000 years ago. So it predates Stonehenge by 5,000 years. So it's 7,000 years older than the pyramids and so on. This site seems to be the largest monumental architecture, the oldest monumental architecture that we know of. And it predates agriculture as we know it, which some people are using to suggest that instead of the usual story, which says that we invented agriculture and then we built cities, that in fact maybe we started to build these sacred sites, monumental architecture where people could come together, and that stimulated the domestication of grain. So that civilization through agriculture might have actually sprung from this more fundamental drive of humans to come together around a sacred center, which would develop into a city. Next slide. This is a picture of Ur. the city that Abraham is supposed to have come from. And in the middle of the city, or at least in the most prominent place, is the ziggurat, which is where the sacred rites were performed. Now this city, it would have been in modern-day Iraq, in the Tigris-Euphrates basin, probably around 2000 BCE. Next slide. This is Karnak in Egypt. So around the same time, giant complex built exclusively for the celebration and perpetuation of a divine human being, the pharaoh, and his court. Right? So this evolution of the polis is being organized around a sacred sort of archetypal living presence of the God-man, of a human that is somehow incarnating a divine presence. Next. This is a model of ancient Rome, which at its height at the time of the Roman Empire, of course, it got a lot smaller after the fall of Rome, and then it's gotten a lot bigger since, of course. But this is how it would have looked about 2,000 years ago, with the Roman Forum in the middle, where all the temples were, and so on. Next. This is a typical medieval type city. It's called Altstadt in Germany. And two things to notice, first of all, is the kind of cellular membrane around the city. Of course, it's for defense, but it's also for a kind of psychic containment. And it allows the energy of the polis, of the human community, to stay sort of focused on itself in a way. And in the center, the most prominent place, just like the ziggurat of Ur, in this case, it's the cathedral that is in the center. Now, that was typical of cities throughout the whole of the Middle Ages, in fact, until modern times. Next. This is Teotihuacan in Mexico. Some of you may have been there. Great city, mysterious. We don't know much about it really. The Great Pyramid of the Sun is the largest pyramid at the base that we know of. Next. Thank you, Chad, by the way, for doing this. This is a contemporary rendition of, where's Adrian? Is Adrian here?
He left today.
Okay, Tenochtitlan. I don't know how to say it properly. Tenochtitlan, which became Mexico City. And so Mexico City, before it was more or less razed by the Spanish conquistadors. And you see again, it's basically a mandala, right? It's a sacred precinct organized around a center, and in this case the center was dominated by the Great Pyramid, where the blood rites were performed to maintain the vitality and sustain the city. Right? Next. This is another image of Tenochtitlan. So Tenochtitlan in 1492, which was the year of contact, was that the year of contact between Cortez and Montezuma? I thought it was 1492. Pretty much around 1492.
Well, that would have been Columbus.
Oh, sorry.
What a Canadian!
Very soon. When is it? 1504? Okay. So about 10 years later, 9 10 years later. This city would have been either the most populous city, it rivaled Paris, certainly, in its opulence and splendor and population. Around 1500. Now what's happening at this point, around 1500 of course, is right before humans have for the first time circumnavigated the globe. This is very important. Even though some humans may have thought, and we know that some humans did think, that the earth was round, no humans had actually experienced it, proven it, by actually sailing around it and keeping in their memory the experience that yes, the earth is a ball. And from that point, about 500 years ago, humans start enacting an ongoing circulation of the planet through conquest, but also through exchange, through trade, through intermarriage, through cultural exchange, and so on. It's initially, though, the move of empire, the push of empire, which brings about the first conscious human circumnavigation of the planet. Of course, the humans had spread themselves around the planet after leaving Africa about 70,000 years ago. It took them about 30,000 years by foot to finally make it to all of the continents, and in fact, cover the globe. But those humans didn't know about all the other humans on the globe. So from 70,000 years ago to only 500 years ago, humans had spread out in this diaspora around the planet. Starting 500 years ago, they start to bump into each other, and a new planetary consciousness is emerging called the planetary, that we can call the planetary era. Right after this circumnavigation, of course, Copernicus revolutionizes Western cosmology, the so-called Copernican revolution, by proposing a mathematical model of the solar system with the sun at the center instead of the Earth. And something else is happening here. So this is the birth of the planetary era in a second sense, therefore. With Copernicus, the Earth becomes a planet, like the other planets. See, before that, in the medieval world picture, the Earth wasn't a planet, it was the Earth, with all the other planets, with all of the planets circling around it. But with the Copernican revolution, the Earth actually becomes a planet, like the other planets. It becomes a cosmological entity, not something separate from or distinct from the cosmos. At least that's how the scientific imagination starts to picture it. So with Copernicus, about 500 years ago, we have also the birth of the planetary era in two senses. Next. What's happening at this time as well, right about the time, actually it's, within less than a century of the Copernican revolution, you get a spate of utopias. The first one here is, the most famous is Thomas More's utopia. They all cluster, most of them, the most famous ones, cluster around 1600. So these European visionaries at the beginning of the planetary era are trying to imagine an ideal polis, an ideal human community. And they do this typically by imagining an isolated island that is away from civilization as they know it, where some ideal society lives. Now, More's utopia was communistic. It was, in many ways, a very noble dream, but probably few of us would want to live there for other reasons. It was pretty severe in its discipline. Next.
No Rolling Stones.
No Rolling Stones. This is the only image I can find online. I'm surprised. A depiction of Thomas Campanella's Civitas Soli, the city of the sun. City of the sun. So he had his vision of this ideal polis with a temple at the center and rings, various rings on the walls of which the lore of the cosmos would be engraved. It was a kind of esoteric astrological, or a hybrid of high Catholicism and esoteric astrology for Campanella. Next. This is just another depiction of one of these cities. This is the Civitas Veri. Next. This is Christianopolis. But actually, when you read the account of the city, it's, to me, I mean, Campanella's is very appealing because of the esotericism. But Christianopolis, which was written by the same man who wrote the founding documents of the Rosicrucian movement, Johann Christian Andre, he wrote this as well. It was actually quite a nice place to live in terms of morals, at least. And, it was a very heartful place. We don't have time to get into it. But the point I want to make here, though, is that at the birth of the planetary era, humans are trying to imagine a way of living together that's going to be sustainable. And sustainable primarily by virtue of its alignment with some kind of ideal, whether that ideal is patterned off of Calvinist Geneva, or whether it's patterned off of a more esoteric version of Plato's Republic, or some kind of Rosicrucian Christian pietistic dream like Christianopolis. Next. This is Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. Now, it's maybe hard to see some of the details, but it's Bacon's vision that had the most influence, because Bacon, at the core of Bacon's New Atlantis, or the new city, was the prototype of what became the Royal College of London, which is the first and most successful of the scientific societies. It was going to be the vehicle through which not only the Copernican revolution, but the science that came out of it eventually, which we identify mostly with Newton. So the Newtonian world picture, next slide, which came to be epitomized by this ideal of a clockwork universe. The cosmos is like a clock, a mechanism. They can be predicted with absolute certainty, and therefore controlled and put to our human uses. This was the dream that took hold, that we first see in Bacon's New Atlantis, but which became a reality by virtue of the great genius and success of Newtonian science. Next. Now, as a result of this, not only Newtonian science, but the Industrial Revolution, the first Industrial Revolution of the late 18th century, and then the second Industrial Revolution of the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, as a result of this scientific revolution, look what happens to world population. Like that. So it's, it starts to happen. Actually, you see it at the very beginnings of the Renaissance. But as soon as the scientific revolution has proven its usefulness, that's what happens. Now, this is also coincided, of course, with the the rise of the West and the colonial domination of the globe, and so on, right? So this is the human presence suddenly explodes on the planet. Next. And the cities get transformed from these basically medieval walled cities with churches at the center to this kind of city. At least this becomes the prototype for what a city should be, what the polis should be. And instead of a cathedral, of course, you have the banks dominating the skyline. Now, obviously, in this case, these particular symbols do not dominate the skyline anymore through the tragedy that lives on in our memories and nightmares. Next. This is Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, 500 years later. Next. Shanghai. Next. Tokyo. Tokyo, the most populated city on the planet, 38 million people, as much as my country, Canada. That's one city. More than half as much as lived in the Roman Empire at its height. It's one city. Now, think all of this is happening, remember, in that last thousandth of a centimeter. So the Earth is a bowl of molten rock in a trance. Somehow it turns into life. Dreaming and dreaming and dreaming. And then, bang! It's completely covered by the human presence. Lit up at night, megalopolises, 6 mass extinction. And, however, possibly waking up to herself for the first time as Gaia. Next slide. This image is from 1959, and it's the first satellite image of Earth from space. But think of it.
What year?
1959. Think of it though. This is the first time Gaia saw herself in the mirror. Right? Still really groggy. I know what that feels like. So it's not just a technological artifact of a satellite beaming something back. It's Gaia having self-organized changed really quickly to the point where she can start to look at herself from space. 1959. Actually, the first image from the very nearest reaches of space, it wasn't quite orbital, was in 1946. And it was a V2 rocket that the Americans sent up with a camera. And you can watch the clip on YouTube, actually, if you Google it. But 59. Next. Didn't take long from 59 to the early 70s at the end of the Apollo mission to send back, this image. This is not the most famous Earthrise image, which was taken. Is Drew still here?
No,
Drew's
I
waiting.
think it's
Oh, you had to leave.
Yeah.
Well, the first Earthrise, I think, was Apollo 8 in
68.
68? Yeah, 68. This is actually from 1972. But in between 68, which was that most famous Earthrise picture, and 1972, which is at the end of the Apollo program, you have, next slide, Earth Day, the first Earth Day. This is not the first Earth Day, but it's the only thing I can find quickly online. 1970, the first Earth Day. Okay, so this spontaneous organization, millions upon millions of people carrying this new consciousness of Gaia, which was catalyzed by the Apollo program. Now think of this, the Apollo program, among other things, was an expression of empire, right? It was an assertion on the part of the American empire, locked in a Cold War with the Soviet empire, trying to prove its supremacy. Now it was more than that, obviously. One of the things more that was, I would suggest, was almost a ploy or a cunning, a ruse on the part of Gaia, half awake, half dreaming, wanting to become conscious of herself. How can she do this, right? Well, she needed to organize herself in such a way that part of herself could get into space to see herself from space as a whole. And the reality is that we probably couldn't have done that without empire and a Cold War. This is one of the tragic paradoxes of the emergence of Gaian consciousness, is that it has been mediated through empire, through war and death, as well as through the noblest ideals of science and these things together. It's a mixed bag. Next. Just a few more slides. Space station. Next. Love this. Just think. This is not a human being in a spacesuit floating above Gaia. This is Gaia masqueraded as a human being in a spacesuit floating above Gaia. Right? Next. This is the Earth and the Moon taken from the Explorer mission on the way to Mars. Next. Okay. This is from Google Earth that I captured just before coming here. And it's a picture of the North Pole without any ice at the pole. You can see Greenland still has its ice. Now this is very significant because within our lifetime, the last few years, for the first time since the beginning of the planetary era, which was launched by the dream of finding a passage to India, a northwest passage to India, which at first failed because they ran into North America. And they couldn't do it because of the ice. Well, now they can do it. So it is possible now to take that route. Next. This is a computer representation of many of the objects currently surrounding the Earth, which it's called space junk, actually. I think most of these are not active anymore. Next. This is another representation of space junk. Now, of course, the ones that are active we're totally dependent on for all of our telecommunications, for much of the informational infrastructure that envelops the Earth, the technosphere, the informational technosphere that we depend upon. is mediated by these objects, but many of them are not used anymore. They're obsolete, just like our cell phones go obsolete. Now, unfortunately, there's a very real risk of this thing happening called the Kessler syndrome, where if one of these things smashes into another and breaks up, as the pieces are moving so fast, they will eventually hit another piece which breaks up, and you get a chain reaction. So it's not outside of the realm of possibility, and some people think that we have to really work at making it less than probable that there could be a cascading effect and basically an annihilation of a good part of these objects. So I don't really know, I'm not an expert on this, but people are working on it because you can imagine how catastrophic it would be if the Kessler syndrome is triggered. Something has to change, right? This is not sustainable, and it's sort of a global analog to what is not sustainable at the level of the polis, at the level of actual physical cities, and at the level of human civilization. Something has to change. How can we change that? What direction can we go in? And I'll be taking way too much time. I'll try to speed it up. Let's just go through the slides. Next. Well, this is one dream of changing it. Paolo Soleri's, one of his cities, which doesn't look too appealing to me. It would have when I was 13 and really into Star Trek. But the principle and his ideal of acrology, merging ecology and architecture, is a beautiful ideal. And if we could sustain that kind of high-tech solution, this might be a direction that we would want to go in terms of rethinking our cities. Next. This is another direction based on the emerging field of biomimicry, so where we are looking to life forms, the morphology, the form of life, and the peerless fusion of form and function in the natural world, and trying to pattern our technologies after that, and even our cities. Next. This is a biomimicry-inspired sort of object that it could be the pattern of the city. Next. Here we have some smart buildings with interior gardens and so on. So this is the technotopic version of how to try to get out of our unsustainable cities, is by better technology, more technology, which will be patterned off of Gaia's ways. But it's not the only way. Next. When do you know what that is? Death Star. It's actually a model of the first dream of Auroville in India, which was the first eco-village. And it's probably the most impressive example of an eco-village on the planet now. It is sustainable. They transformed the next slide. This is what they built, though, from the as compared to the original model. Next. It's all centered around the Matrimandir, this temple, this object that focalizes psycho-spiritual energy, helping the community be sustainable and aligned with the divine. Next. It's another current movement that is not high-tech. In fact, it's the opposite. It's not looking to industrial growth society and the fruits of high technology for a solution, but to our local communities, recognizing that we're at a point of peak oil where the technology that we depend upon needs to undergo radical change, but even more important, we need to learn to live together in sustainable ways based in our local communities in a way that's not dependent on oil, but where we can renew our human relations. Next. Eco-village curriculum. So, only to suggest that the ideal of eco-villages and the learning around them is not just a question of physical sustenance, and how we can have physical structures and enough food and so on, but it's a question of values in human relations. Next. This is a permaculture, eco-village. How many of you have heard of permaculture? Probably a lot.
Go team!
We have a lot of permaculturists in our community. Next. Another permaculture image. This is Blair. He's our resident permaculture guru. Now what you see here is, so permaculture, permanent culture. Instead of a culture or a civilization, polis, that is unsustainable and doomed to collapse, we have the ideal of a human mode of being that is sustainable, if not permanent to all eternity, at least sustainable in a way that's in harmony with the ways of the earth. We don't have time to go into permaculture here, unfortunately, but this leads us to the whole ideal of the earth. What are the ways of the earth, of Gaia? Next. Oh, sorry, next. That's just another permaculture one. Now, I just throw this out as a way of organizing the rest of the slides to try to come to an integral view of Gaia. And I'm using here the idea of quadrants that's been popularized by Ken Wilber, who basically took Teilhard de Chardin's insight that the cosmos has both an outside and an inside, right? A within and a without, along with Carl Jung's idea of the importance of the relationship between the individual and the collective. So if you cross those two relationships, individual, collective, within, without, you get a helpful starting point for thinking in an integral way. So if we think of Gaia from the outside, as it were, and as an individual, what do we get? Well, Gaia theory is one example. So an emerging scientific discipline, which is actually a meeting of many disciplines, that is revealing the ways in which Gaia is a single, self-organizing system. Miraculous. So next slide. James Lovelock, next slide. Lynn Margulis, the two founders of Gaia theory. It started off as a Gaia hypothesis, now it's a Gaia theory, and it's the basis of what's also called Earth system science. Next slide. We don't have time to get into that. Next slide. This is the old view of the relationship between the abiotic environment, like rocks, water, air, and living organisms. Basically, that living organisms were basically riding on this abiotic environment, had no essential relationship to it. Next slide. Gaia theory, however, shows that in fact the Earth is a single self-regulating system, that in fact the air we breathe, the continental shelves upon which we float, have been shaped by life. The air, the oceans. So life and non-life are a tightly coupled system that have created the Earth as we know it over thousands of millions of years. Right? So that's the essence of Gaia theory. Next. This just shows you one very important aspect of Gaia theory is the carbon cycle that's crucial for the regulation of the global temperature. We're hearing a lot about that now, right? If the CO2 in the atmosphere goes beyond 380 parts per million, which it is already, but if it goes much beyond 500 parts per million, Lovelock, for one, thinks that will be catastrophic. Now many people believe we still have 5 to 10 years to turn things around. We may not, it may be too late. But many people believe we still have 5 to 10 years to turn things around. But this is a fascinating cycle to contemplate and get a sense of Gaia as an organism. Next slide. This is just a graph showing the oscillation of, within a mean, however, an oscillation of the CO2 in the atmosphere as measured from the Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. And basically what it shows is Gaia's breathing, the in-breath and the out-breath of Gaia year by year. But it also shows the gradual increase of CO2 in the atmosphere. So it's like Gaia is getting out of breath and having to breathe faster and faster in order to try to cool herself. Next slide. This is just a representation of the thermal Haline current, the great circulation of Gaia. just like shortly after the birth of the planetary era, Harvey discovered the circulation, or at least demonstrated convincingly the circulation of the blood in the body. Well, this is something very analogous, the circulation of water in the oceans as a result of the differential of temperature, which of course could stop if Greenland melts, or if the Arctic, the Antarctic shelves break up enough, this whole circulation could stop, which would be another catastrophic event. Next slide. Of course, Gaia is not just this coupling of abiotic and biotic systems. It is that, or she is that, fundamentally. That's what she was for thousands of millions of years. But for better or worse, during that last fraction of a moment, the human presence has added another sphere to the biosphere. You could say it's the anthroposphere, the human sphere. And the one that is most interesting to many of us in our program is the so-called mental sphere, the noosphere, the thinking sphere of the Earth. This is a representation of the global brain. I think it was Peter Russell that had this particular image created. So next slide. In other words, an integral approach to Gaia needs to include the anthroposphere, the human presence, as integral to Gaia. So we move then from seeing Gaia from the outside, as it were, and as a single individual, to now the lower left quadrant, which is looking at Gaia from the inside, or where we are, as it were, in our experience, and as a collective. And as an example of that emerging consciousness, I've chosen the Earth Charter. I forgot to tease that. How many of you have heard of the Earth Charter? Okay. Seems to be mostly students. Well, the Earth Charter is a wonderful thing, and it was finally put together in this massive collaborative, international collaborative effort from early 1990s to 2000. And it is a kind of not a constitution, but it's a sort of prolegomenon to a planetary constitution. It's an articulation of 4 fundamental pillars of what could be a new polis, a Gaiapolis. Next slide. This is a picture of the Earth Charter Initiative, but it shows this fusion of the human and Gaia, and it's through the human that Gaia is awakening to herself. Next slide. This is just the preamble, along with the 4 pillars, and each of the 4 pillars has 4 principles. So we have like 4 times 4. I didn't include the principles there, it'd be too much to read. 4 times 4, a kind of mandala, square, Earth Charter, articulating these ideals of the Earth community. We don't really have time to read it, but you can read the preamble there. I'm not going to read it for you. Next slide. This is the arc of the Earth Charter. Sort of the arc of the new covenant. Quite beautiful. Next slide. But this whole idea of the Earth Charter and the Ark of the Covenant is not liked by some groups, which think that it's part of a global conspiracy for planetary domination. And in a sense it is. Right? But so here we have various events and organizations culminating in, if I can read this, the Copenhagen Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is the irreversible treaty.
Legally binds.
So what's it? Can you all read it?
Yeah.
All right. So basically, so it's the global conspiracy idea
The
that is.
controlled global society that has ushered in by design using climate change as a hoax to enslave us all.
Right. Okay. So it's it's laughable, but it's chilling and it's fascinating at the same time. There is some truth to this chart. Right? It's pointing to real relations between events and organizations that is trying to get to something. Not only the Earth Charter, next slide, but to something that I'm calling Earth Federation. So this is now the lower right quadrant, where we're looking at from the outside again. The Earth, Gaia as a collective from the outside. Earth Federation. Next slide. This is the United Federation of Planets. That was my ideal growing up. Star Trek, I was one of the first Trekkies. Just as the Apollo mission was a religious experience for me, I tracked the moon landings, I drew pictures of all of the stages of the mission from takeoff to re-entry. I wanted to be an astronaut. Something else happened. I switched from outer space to inner space in my exploration, but I still was interested in the cosmos and Star Trek. Next slide. This is the Star Trek universe. So the ideal was that Starfleet. Now, of course, the Starfleet Academy was, remember, it was in San Francisco. And it was headed by the Americans, of course, who were the exponents, the living example of this ideal of the United Federation of Planets. Very noble. If you read Gene Roddenberry's story, watch the early Star Trek, even the second generation, very noble ideals. But if that was a kind of stand-in for American empire and American exceptionalism, that whole ideal of the late 60s and late 60s especially, around 1970, right after the Apollo mission, collapsed pretty fast, as we know. Next slide. However, in the 1990s, surprisingly, for the first time ever, we started getting the first observational data proving that there are other planets out there. I mean, you'd think it would be obvious there are other planets. You look up at the night sky, there's so many stars, but we had no real evidence. We could see stars, but we didn't know that other stars had planets around them. Until 1999, was it? The first extrasolar planet was discovered. Now, the way they discover it, it's not that we have a telescopic Hubble or otherwise image of it, but there's ways of analyzing light from these distant stars, from which we can deduce the presence of these planets. It's quite extraordinary. The techniques are getting more and more refined, and since 1999 we now have a list of almost 300 extrasolar planets, and they're all pretty close to us. This first image is looking towards the center of our galaxy through 25,000 light years. Is that right, Brian?
Yes.
Ah! Excellent. 25,000 light years toward the center of our galaxy. That's that first one. That little box up there, this is the detail. And that little cross is where we have recently discovered one of these planets orbiting a star somewhat like our own. It's actually different than our own. Next slide. This is looking in the other direction, away from our galaxy, into deep space. It's one of the deep field, Hubble deep field images, which would, if we were to hold our thumb up to the sky, Brian, would this be just like a fraction of one of our nails?
Well, I don't know about the thumb, but I know with the pinky, behind the pinky it'd be 1 million galaxies.
Behind the pinky would be 1 million galaxies.
So the thumb is beyond
Wow.
2.
So look at that though. I mean, this is a galaxy. Galaxy. So many galaxies looking out, and of course we're in our galaxy. I am convinced, for one, that the cosmos has innumerable planets at various stages of evolution. Probably dozens and dozens and dozens, if not thousands of them, very much like here, at a very similar stage, awakening, wondering whether we're going to make it. That's very comforting. However, I also believe that it's probably highly unlikely that we'll ever get there. Physically. There are other means. You know, as Moody Blue said, thinking is the best way to travel. And there are non-ordinary states. There are people that believe they've already had contact. I know many people. Actually, I know some people who are even, you know, I know a walk-in, so-called a walk-in, somebody who is not from here, who's, anyway, that's a whole the first course I taught at CIS was the myth, in the good sense of the term, the myth of extraterrestrial intelligence, where we looked at the whole history of the UFO phenomenon and theories of extraterrestrial intelligence. I'm fascinated by that still. However, I do believe that the likelihood of us making physical contact with even one of these nearest extrasolar planets, which are light years away, it's so beyond our current technology that we don't have enough time. We may have 5 or 10 years before the Kessler syndrome kicks in, or before the CO2 is too high and the sixth mass extinction is just gone too far, or before the great circulation of the Earth stops. We don't have time. Next slide. So we need to work towards some kind of Earth Federation. There already is. There has been a movement over the last 40 years toward Earth Federation. But this is a kind of top-down ideal where we will have some structure parallel to the United Nations. Right now, the closest we have is the United Nations, and we know how hobbled the United Nations is. I personally believe that we should put our eggs in the basket of the United Nations. That's my belief. While simultaneously we are doing all kinds of other things, not only from the top down, more importantly from the bottom up, where we are now. Next slide. But this is still working, just showing you, I'm just going to show you some things now, things that are going on that are hopeful, more hopeful. Cormac Cullinan, inspired by Thomas Berry, a friend and mentor of Brian's, Robert, came up with this idea of Earth jurisprudence. So a rethinking of law, not only international law, but law as such, based in the ways of Gaia. Okay, so this would be fundamental to not only the Earth Charter, but to some kind of Earth Federation. Next slide. Just a book that came out recently, Jeremy Rifkin, The Empathic Civilization, tries to strike a balance between radical, if not pessimism, at least alarm at the dire nature of our situation on the one hand, and exceptional developments that are happening, both technologically, in terms of research, and in terms of social organization. But clearly, we're in a race to some kind of sustainable polis, some kind of sustainable human presence on the planet. Next slide. Another book, I won't go into the details here. This is a more academic, scholarly, neo-Marxist, and other streams coming into it. But what's interesting about it is that they explore this idea of a new form of the human that they're calling multitude, which is the idea that we are starting to organize ourselves now globally from the bottom up, but mediated through the internet and other forms of social networking. Next slide. Facebook is part of it. Facebook is part of it. Next slide. But so is Wiser Earth and other sites that have been developed. Wiser Earth is a kind of Facebook for people who are self-consciously aligned and devoted to this Gaiapolitan ideal or dream of the Earth. So if you haven't checked out Wiser Earth, check it out. Next slide. It was developed, inspired by the work of Paul Hawken and his book, Blessed Unrest, how the largest social movement in history is restoring grace, justice, and beauty to the world. If you haven't read that book, highly recommended. It's a sign of hope. Thousands upon thousands of non-governmental organizations and informal gatherings of people across the planet, most of whom don't know of each other, but are working in various ways peculiar to their own gifts and aspirations toward this kind of emerging dream of an Earth Federation. Why say Earth Federation? Instead of a united federation of planets, I'm imagining a united planet of federations. So an Earth Federation would itself be a federation of federations. So federations all the way down, as it were, until we get to each one of us. But I'm a federation too, depends on. We're all federations individually. Our bodies are federations of organisms. So a united planet of federations, that seems to be the only, seems to be a way of thinking of what's trying to happen. Next slide. Awakening the Dreamer. Darren and Annabelle here are trained, maybe there are others, but me too, have taken up this really exciting path of catalyzing people's imagination and in training their souls and thoughts with this emerging dream of the Earth toward a sustainable society. If you don't know the Pachamama Alliance and Awakening the Dreamer, check it out. Next slide. This is something more particular to CIS. It's the CIS Gaia Field Center for Subtle Activism. It was created by two of my good friends, doctoral students, and myself. That is meant to facilitate global meditation projects. We did one around the presidential election. Oh, did we lose the cord there?
I think.
Looks like an electrical thing.
Is it still plugged in, Brad? Oh, you're sitting there. We put you there because we thought you would guard the plug. Is the plug still in?
I'll just hold it with my thumb. It's in. Maybe if you press the power button, it'll pop out.
This one?
It's
Trying.
it's trying. Yeah,
Okay.
It just
There we
takes
go.
a while.
Excellent. Okay.
It sort of fell out.
Hopefully we can get it. We're almost done.
Yeah, I got it.
So where were we? Gaia Field. Great. Okay. So the Gaia Field Center for Subtle Activism, global meditations, prayer, they're happening. There are many organizations that are coordinating these collective events that bring together people from different parts of the planet at the same time, or in waves going across the planet. Earth Dance does one every year, that where people at the same time of the day, but because of the time differences, it sort of creates a wave around the planet, where through celebration and other forms of getting together, we participate in this emerging consciousness of Gaia. Next slide. Which brings us to the last quadrant, which is, again, Gaia seen as an individual, but from the within. Here we have Anima Mundi, or the soul of the world. And so it's not enough, at least for us here, maybe it's enough for some people to focus on external social relations, technology, politics, and so on. That's essential. But for many of us, it's all equally essential to bring back, to awaken and deepen the soul dimension, the spiritual dimension of Gaia, soul of the world, Anima Mundi. Next slide. Avatar, current contemporary expression of this reawakening of awareness of the soul of the earth and a kind of longing to participate in the soul of the world. Next slide. This is a a late Renaissance, early planetary era depiction of the Anima Mundi, mediating the earth and the human mind, which is the monkey there, the monkey mind, and the great mystery, the Tetragrammaton, the name of God in the heavens. Next slide. Animate earth, just to show you how these four quadrants are actually starting to interpenetrate in the works of many people. Stephen Harding's book on Gaia theory. Stephen Harding worked pretty closely with James Lovelock, but is taking Gaia theory to the next step by explicitly introducing the Anima Mundi, the soul of the earth, into reflection on the science of Gaia. Beautiful book, if you don't know it. Next. Well, this is different approaches to the Anima Mundi. These are ley lines. Next. Another ley line Now, what are ley lines? Ley lines are basically, next, what that is for human bodies, right? These are the acupuncture meridians on the body. What I was trying to suggest here, there's different approaches to the anima mundi. You can either think of, on the most fundamental level, the earth as alive, and whatever's alive is as animate, has a soul. You can do it more esoterically, as we find in traditional Chinese medicine, where the body has not only its physical energy, but a more subtle energy like qi. Similarly, the earth has its own qi that some people claim to be able to track through these ley lines. Next slide. For instance, Marko Plakacnik, a Slovenian practitioner, has developed his own form of lithopuncture, acupuncture for the earth. He and the people he trains are able to tune into where imbalances are on the earth, not only in countryside but in the city, and intervene at key points with symbolically imprinted stone acupuncture needles for the earth. Isn't that exciting? I want to get trained in that. Seriously. Next. This is a Renaissance portrayal of what's called Metaphesic Man, showing the correspondence between the microcosm and the macrocosm. In this case, the human body and the heavens, right? Where each organ of the body, each part of the body, and the psychological sort of profile corresponding to those parts of the body are resonant with the signs of the zodiac and the planets that rule them. Next. Oh, what do you know? For those of you who don't know this book, this is Rick Tarnas's most recent book. I can't praise it. I don't have time to praise it enough. I won't. But it's yet another indication of an emerging field, in this case archetypal astrology, which is an invitation to participate in the living dance of meaning between the planets, the heavens, and human life. So it's an expression, I think, a beautiful expression, but one that is also being worked out in a living research community, of the soul of the earth. The soul of the earth, in this case, as experienced and tracked through the movements of the planets and the relationships they make to the earth from our position as the eyes of the earth. Next slide. This is sort of what we get here at Esalen. The stars and planets as living presences, vortices of soul. And this is, I think, what we're all craving, right? Is an experience of being not only on Gaia, but in Gaia, just as Gaia is in the womb of the cosmos. It doesn't feel so right? Contained within the living matrix of Gaia, looked over by these spiritual presences that have accompanied Gaia from her beginning, from that deep trance, through her early dreaming, through her fitful wakening, right? Next slide. At the moment, however, we seem to be poised. I just found out at the last Burning Man, the theme was Metropolis. I didn't know that. But this is the poster of the movie Metropolis. And the metropolis in that movie is really the megalopolis of an unsustainable city that is built actually on a form of apartheid between rich and poor, where the rich, the privileged, have control over high technology and so on, if you don't know the story. So we seem poised between Metropolis, this kind of dream that has possessed the earth for quite a long time, and a kind of another expression of Gaia. This is a little new age. I call it green fractal Gaia. Next slide. Alex Gray. This is the last slide, by the way. So here we have, I think, a really compelling expression of our moment. We're at this axis of the turning of the ages of Gaia. And an invitation poised between the unsustainable polis, or human arrangement on the right, and the possibility of a harmonious and mutually sustaining relationship with the rest of our Earth community on the left here. And it's all dependent upon whether or not we can tune in to that center. There's no guarantee, but if there is any hope, it will come from that kind of alignment. Thank you. Given this before, I didn't know how long it was going to take. I apologize for it taking so long. Do we still have time for a bit of a conversation?
Sure.
Feel free to leave, do whatever you want, but I'm here and we're here, so. Hi.
Firstly, thank you. Everything you said really, really resonated with me and really resonated with ideas that I've had in my head for a while, and just gave some kind of clarification and new material for developing those. Secondly, I just wanted to make a comment on the lithopuncture that you mentioned.
Yeah.
Becca and I last year had the pleasure of seeing a talk similar to this one at, I don't know if you know Hollyhock Institute in British Columbia.
Yeah.
And it was from a gentleman, a doctor from China who had participated in tuning into these ley lines and finding the energy points on the Earth, and he showed us a slide presentation of pagodas around the world.
Oh, nice.
Exactly how you were showing there. And an interesting point that he made out is that at the moment we're able to kind of scientifically tune into these. Humans as a race, as a species, have been doing it for thousands of years, and he pointed out how like the Great Pyramids, a lot of the Seven Wonders of the world, even places like Esalen and Hollyhock have all been built on these energy. St. Peter's in Rome, exactly, yeah. And we've been doing it for thousands of years intuitively, without any of this scientific rigor that we have in modernity. So, I just wanted to make that comment and share that.
Yeah, if you have any information on that, I'd love it if you send it to me.
Sure.
That's very exciting.
The Peace Pagoda Project.
Peace Pagoda Project?
Yeah.
I remember that. Really?
Just quick on that same note, all over Europe, there's standing stones that are along ley lines as well, that are, I'm sure, similar. I mean, who knows, because they're ancient sites. But often they'll be in lines, so you'll have like stones set up along these lines, or they also make mounds, right? Mounded earth. Some of them that you could actually enter inside of, and it was sort of like a heightened energy area. And they're finding the same thing with pyramids. It's sort of like a place to collect the energy and sort of be that sort of acupuncture point. It's really interesting.
I just love the idea, though. Imagine if we could go through San Francisco, where your cities are, and the surrounding area. If you had your intuition or your senses developed enough where you could know where to intervene to encourage a more healthy flow of energy. Now, presumably, what that would do is it could catalyze the populations who live in those areas to become more sustainable in other ways. I mean, that's the hope. Masood, then Blair.
Okay. Can I have the
Can you speak up?
Yeah, I think people can see the last slide on the monitor. Yes. Okay. That's cool. In this Gaia, this so connected and fully aware Gaia, I just feel well, like, I'm not so comfortable by the idea of Earth seeing herself for the first time in 1959.
Well, even if you stretch it back 20,000 years, Masood, even if you stretch it back to the origin of our species, 200,000 years ago, makes no difference from Gaia's perspective. It's still that last, right?
Yeah.
So,
Well, when do you want it?
yeah, when do you want it to be?
Pick a date.
Well, you know, like the egocentric, you know, the
It's-
CIG thing, when we recognize our face on the mirror, and then we separate from the oceanic flow of life, and we identify ourselves as a singular being, as ego,
Humans, you mean?
humans.
Yeah, well, that happened. That
This is the
happened.
developmental stage that we are going through our life. That's
Right.
18 months.
Right.
So I think that, you know, I just think that maybe the same mistake might take place if we think that Gaia see herself for the first time when we saw it for the first time.
Ah. Okay, I'll think about that. Maybe we can discuss it later to make sure I fully understand what your concern is. Blair?
That's a dovetail. I think it's important to acknowledge the dangers of
Can we speak up?
anthropomorphizing things. But at the same time,
What's
I
the
learned
danger?
a tremendous amount. So what's that?
You said it's a danger to...
I said I want to acknowledge, I think there is a danger in anthropomorphizing everything, and it's important to have distinction there, but at the same time, throughout your presentation, which I learned a tremendous amount from, something that made it really effective was your speaking as Gaia from the first person.
Yeah.
And so in that way, it kind of dissolves separation, the kind of concern that Masood is having here. And in particular with your presentation, it was really effective.
Thank you.
It really gave
Well,
a sense of-
for me, the challenge has been, we're so conditioned to think of humans as not only late arrivals, but either lords of nature or somehow separate from nature. But clearly, what at least our investigations have shown, regardless of other spiritual dimensions, is that physically and historically and psychologically, we are not other than Gaia. We are Gaia, right? We carry Gaia in each one of our cells, the evolution of Gaia in the structure of our cells and DNA, and so yeah, thank you. The point is not to separate human from Gaia, or to say that humans are the only possible way that Gaia can be self-conscious. I personally believe that just as mind consciousness, Sean, whoever that is, most of the time, is a very low grade of consciousness that's trying to awaken, more or less successfully on certain days. But below or behind, as Sri Aurobindo would say, that Sean, I believe, is my soul. Sri Aurobindo calls it the psychic being. And that's in a sense, my true self, which is not other than Sean, but embraces Sean. But the true Sean is more than just this ego, right? So similarly, it wouldn't surprise me if Gaia also has a psychic being, the anima mundi, that was there from the beginning, even before the ball of molten rock, right? Even before the dust particles from the last supernova coalesced to form that ball of molten rock. I believe there was an anima mundi. There was a soul of the earth. But that's metaphysics and esoteric cosmology and so on, which I love to think about. And somebody like Rudolf Steiner, for instance, has seen clairvoyantly, at least given one clairvoyant account of those prior ages in the evolution of the Gaian soul. But from the point of view, at least of science, and what we can reconstruct of the history of Gaia and the evolution of Gaia, it seems that the humans are playing that role. That they are the part of Gaia that enables Gaia to see herself in our time. At least that's what I'm proposing. It's not my proposal. I mean, Teilhard de Chardin was the first one to propose it. I'm just continuing that line of thinking. Jake?
Sean, I wonder if I could draw you out a little bit more on moving from Gaiapolis to Gaia politics.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, you gave some suggestions for what a Gaia politics and what a united planet of federations would look like, but I'm wondering if, I mean, do you imagine it as the kind of planetization of some of our best practices now, or do you, I know I'm asking you to speculate, but I'm wondering just what kind of intuitions you have about the shape of a politics that would be adequate to the kind of vision you laid out.
That's a really good question, and it's my edge because my tendency is more toward the metaphysical, the spiritual, the symbolic, and so on. So I've had to really push myself to try to inhabit this political dimension because I think it's so important to think about. And it's really hard for me to see. All that I can see is that if the Kessler syndrome doesn't wipe out the internet, then something like what Hart and Negri are talking about in their book Multitude seems to be a hopeful possibility. Namely, that despite itself, the forces of global capitalism and the informational infrastructure that it's using, that we're most familiar with through the internet, and particularly through social networking technology, that might enable a spontaneous reorganization of human relations, both locally and internationally, globally. Right? So that the human system, the human presence is so far from equilibrium right now. Just as the climate system and the biosphere is. The biosphere, we don't know what's going to happen. It could cascade into a kind of collapse. It could heat up, or Lovelock is now saying that it could actually go into an ice age very, very quickly. We don't know. It's so far from equilibrium. Similarly, the human presence is so complex and superheated that it's conceivable that very small changes could precipitate a very sudden reorganization. We don't know. But if that happened, presumably if it were to be effective, it would need to be accompanied by movements from two directions. One, a toppling of certain kinds of powers at the top, and whether that can be done peacefully, hopefully that would be the case. Simultaneously, the building of new structures from the bottom up, as we have in the transition town movement, and the relocalization movement, and the urban renewal movements, and so on. These have to happen simultaneously. And the hope is that they will meet in a way that will be sustainable before collapse. But there's no guarantee, right? This is the great stakes and uncertainty of our time, whether it will be one way or the other. And I personally have to contemplate the prospect that we may not succeed. I probably won't be around individually, like Sean Kelly won't be around, but the psychic being and some other life that participates in my soul nature will be around. So I am concerned, not just because selfishly my psychic being, because ultimately my psychic being is not other than your psychic being. Like here we're getting metaphysical. Does that sort of go in the direction?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Adam, and then.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you could say something about how you see the difference between Gaia and nature, or like the sort of scientific atmospheric, sort of scientific idea over here, and then like nature, which is sort of an older idea, but you're kind of using the words interchangeably sometimes, and I don't know if that's just habit or if,
right.
I don't know, maybe you can say something about Hegel too, and sitting in the background.
Well, initially Gaia is nature as nature appears as a planet. So Gaia is nature as our planet. That's a basic way of thinking of it. And initially Gaia doesn't really include, the human is there, but is not essential to Gaia initially, right? Because Gaia was around for these thousands of millions of years before humans and was operating just fine, was functioning just fine. But as we've seen, no sooner do humans appear than whatever the human is inextricable from Gaia. So Gaia is not just nature. There is no, if nature at least is that which is prior to human and in a sense distinct from human, Gaia is not nature. Gaia is some kind of, at least now, inextricable fusion of the old nature and the human. That's what, to me, what Gaia is. That's what Gaia has seemed to want to become. Right? Gaia seems to have wanted to become alive, and then seems to have wanted to become conscious of herself. And the way that seems to have happened is through the emergence of the planetary era and all of these developments that we've run through here. So Gaia is this complex whole of nature, human, inextricable, complex whole, a weaving together of the natural and the human, which I try to underline by saying Gaiapolis, but to focus particularly on the key role of cities and human communities in making it sustainable. Actually, Shannon, I think, and then Jeremy,
Kelly.
and then Kelly. Yeah.
So I was really struck by the image of all the organizations that are disbelieving the Earth Charter.
Oh no, they were all they were all
There was
actually.
only one.
Those are all good organizations.
Those are all good organizations. Yeah, no, they were all good, but they were put together by people who believe that they're all part of a demonic plot to control us all, to take away our individual liberties, and dominate the planet with a secular, godless.
Okay, so I spent a lot of
pantheistic
time on the battles
faith.
today, so my brain's like.
That's all right. I ran through it really fast, and I didn't make it clear.
But okay, so maybe in keeping with that newfound optimism, my question was. Brian's always good for that. Do you feel like disbelievers, commonly under the umbrella of conservatives, are coming around to believe in climate change, one, and if not, or for those who are still not, how might we coax them to come over?
Well, there are many evangelicals and even growing numbers of fundamentalists that accept the idea of the fact of climate change and are working toward a sustainable future. So that's a very hopeful sign. Actually, Sam and Elizabeth are more aware of those developments than I am from their work with the Forum on Religion and Ecology that has been documenting these really hopeful developments. So even within evangelical Christianity and fundamentalist Christianity, some forms, this is happening. But there are other groups and factions that are maintaining not only this skepticism about climate change, but are very resistant to the emergence of some kind of global, some kind of Earth Federation. So,
What do we do with them?
love them.
There's one Republican in Congress who is willing to openly support the reality of climate change. One. And when he talks to the other Republicans saying that, they're in disbelief. Like there's a Times article on this week.
Yeah. So many of these people you will not be able to convince, but hopefully we can still have loving and meaningful relationships with people that have radically different worldviews, because we're going to have to live with them anyway. And then just spend the rest of our time seeking out allies, those with whom we can actually do productive work together. That's what I would do. I wouldn't waste my time trying to convert anybody. The truth will out soon enough, even for those who choose to deny.
I was struck by at the end of your talk, you were kind of pointing towards the emergence of
Speak up to those at the back.
Oh, the emergence of social networks, various media portals such as publications and that sort of thing. We're articulating this as though this were an expression of this kind of Gaiapolis. And there was a subtext, and you kind of see the World Trade Center on the right side of this picture. It seems to me that in 2001, there was a degree of media saturation in all these global markets that was available for the projection of that event, right? The shock, awe, terror, the images that we've seen over and over again that have defined, for better or worse, the narrative of the last decade.
Yeah.
And it does seem like that was an event of a globally, collectively held thought, for better or for worse, but it was an image, an archetypal image that still is very resonant, and it's a unified image in the sense that it was an event that everyone has a perspective on, that has shaped sort of the subsequent balkanization and alienation and retrenching of religious ideologies and what have you, this kind of retractment from the sort of hopefulness that we had going into the millennium towards what you're kind of pointing. And I'm wondering if you might riff for a little bit on, could you imagine a way in which that same sort of collective realization could occur mediated by this interconnected totality, right? Of a nature of a utopian image, of a more like collective, like a vision that's not the destruction of empire, but rather the emergence of what you're speaking of. Is that
right?
Am I making?
Yeah, I think so. If I understand you correctly, there are many individuals and organizations that are groping, as Teilhard would say, to create structures, media structures, internet-based structures like Wiser Earth, like the Gaia Field Center for Subtle Activism, like the Earth Dance site, whose purpose is to collect, amplify, and disseminate good news and hopeful, catalytic images, and to create and facilitate participation in events, intentional events, not just waiting for something good to happen, but getting together to make something good happen. Right? So we do this locally, we do it one-on-one, we do it with our friends and our family. We find our kin who may not live locally, even that we can use the internet for. So the trick is to seek out your kin. We're all kin, obviously. But you want to find those who, like Brian was talking the other night about the ideal of philia, a kind of love. You want to find those people who can stimulate a kind of love in you, which will make you become who you are in your soul nature. So the people who embody the ideals, or who are trying to embody the ideals that you admire, seek them out, make and cultivate relations with them, so that we each make ourselves become everything we can be. And if this Gaiapolitan ideal, or whatever you want to call it, is part of that, what you want to be, then people are doing this. The question is, will it happen quickly enough for us to find who we need to find, so that the unforeseeable reorganization of little communities, and then through this mysterious process of noospheric resonance, the global community could reorganize itself quickly enough. We don't know. Some people will be called to do it through more traditional political channels, maybe through the UN, maybe through traditional politics, others through business. We have to do it from all angles at once, wherever we find ourselves and wherever we feel ourselves best called. I'll never have a life in politics, right? So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do what I can do from where I am. But so each of us has to find our virtue and cultivate that. And one of the ways we do that is by seeking out the people that inspire us and trying to be friends with them. You know, because we find each other that way. Kelly?
I'm not sure why it matters to me, but I just wanted to propose to you that perhaps the Earth has been pregnant with human beings. That the Earth has been pregnant with human beings from the moment that Earth existed as an entity. And not only pregnant with human beings, but pregnant with all of life.
Yes.
And that there wasn't that period that you were talking about, kind of before humans or whatever, nature before humans. That there was an image in here that was the brain. It looked
The
like
global brain?
Yeah, the global brain.
Yeah.
I saw it actually as a fetus, like fetus of man, you know, like curled up inside of the Earth's
Wow.
womb.
Right.
But the fetus being not a baby, but adult man.
That's right. Well, I mean, the alternative is that, right, we have chemicals, and somehow, accidentally, life emerged, somehow, accidentally, it organized itself into complex life forms, and eventually into humans, and eventually into you. That's one story, and to me, it's a ridiculous story. As Sri Aurobindo said, if matter evolves into life, life must be involved in matter from the beginning. Otherwise, how could a ball of molten rock suddenly become life? So similarly, if matter becomes humans, thinking Gaia and loving Gaia, then as you say, Kelly, that human potential must be involved in the rock, in the rocks to begin with. This is what Teilhard believed
And
as
this
well.
image right here feels to me like the Ouroboros seeing its, you know, that place where the Ouroboros is eating its own tail. It must look something like this.
Neat.
Michelle, before we break up,
Yeah.
like, what are the criteria? Like, how can we spot a walk-in? Like, what do we look for?
Tall, white hair.
They're impossible to tell. They have to reveal themselves to you. You know, unlike there are experiencers that have their certain signs. There are certain signs that experiencers tend to have that people could recognize and maybe say, I bet you're an experiencer. An experiencer is somebody who's had a close contact, close encounter.
With Jimi Hendrix.
With Jimi yeah, so there's certain psychological profile that you can identify, and there's also sometimes a little scar.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
We should probably call it a night. Thank you.
Let's thank him again.